The House Judiciary Committee room was packed that Tuesday afternoon, every seat filled with reporters, congressional staff, and curious citizens who could feel that something big was about to happen. Cameras clicked, pens were ready, and all eyes focused on the witness table. Sitting there was Stephen Miller, former senior advisor to Donald Trump and the driving force behind several tough immigration policies. His expression was tense, his gaze sharp, scanning the room as though assessing every move before it happened. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, calm and composed as she adjusted her microphone. Her demeanor showed focus and quiet confidence, but behind it was unmistakable determination. Over the next half hour, Miller would interrupt her repeatedly, 6 times in total, each time more forceful than the last. Yet, when Crockett finally delivered her 7th response, measured, clear, and unwavering, she brought the entire room to a standstill. In that instant, the tone of the hearing changed completely. Within moments, clips of their exchange spread across social media, gathering millions of views. The confrontation became a flashpoint for national discussions about respect, authority, and the balance of power in Washington. The public wanted to know, who truly shapes the political conversation, those who speak the loudest or those who stand their ground with composure? Before we dive deeper into this powerful encounter that captured the nation's attention, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more insightful coverage of key moments that shape our democracy. And if you're watching from home, let us know where you're from in the comments. Your voice matters in keeping accountability alive in public discourse. To understand how this heated moment came to be, we first need to know who these two figures are and why their clash seemed destined from the start. Just 38. Stephen Miller had spent his entire professional life promoting strict immigration enforcement. As one of Trump's closest advisors and his chief speechwriter, Miller played a central role in shaping policies that stirred deep national debate, among them, the border enforcement strategies and the travel restrictions targeting specific nations. Known in Washington for his sharp tone and aggressive debating approach, he was the type who thrived in high-pressure exchanges and rarely showed hesitation. Facing him was Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman lawmaker from Texas who had quickly built a reputation for her sharp questioning and fearless presence in the chamber. At 42, she brought both her legal expertise and moral conviction to the table. Before entering Congress, she worked as a civil rights attorney and public defender, fighting for fairness and equal treatment under the law. Those experiences taught her how to stay composed under pressure and how to handle witnesses who tried to overpower the discussion. Crockett's background gave her a deep understanding of what it means to push harder to be heard, a strength that would soon define the fiery exchange seen by millions. Suburbs, communities that had felt the direct impact of the immigration policies shaped by Stephen Miller. The atmosphere inside the hearing room carried an undeniable weight. The stakes could hardly be higher. The House Judiciary Committee was set to examine the long-term consequences of immigration measures introduced during the Trump administration, especially the family separation policy that had divided thousands of children from their parents at the southern border. Recently disclosed documents showed that government officials were aware of the emotional and psychological harm the policy would cause, yet chose to proceed regardless. This revelation made Miller's testimony all the more critical. He had been summoned to explain his involvement in both crafting and enforcing those directives. For Miller, the hearing wasn't just another day in Washington. It was a chance to defend his legacy and protect his public image. He came armed with neatly organized statistics, carefully rehearsed answers, and his usual air of confidence. To him, this was an opportunity to frame his actions as necessary steps for national security and border control, a vision he continued to defend without hesitation. For Crockett, however, this was far more than a policy debate. It was deeply personal and moral. She had toured detention centers, spoken directly with families torn apart, and seen the pain and confusion in children's faces. Those experiences stayed with her, giving her words a different weight. As a black woman in Congress, she also understood the frustration of being talked over, interrupted, or dismissed, a pattern she had encountered in courtrooms and committee rooms alike. She had faced many like Miller before, people who mistook dominance for intelligence and loudness for authority. The committee room itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Behind Miller sat his legal team and advisors, all dressed in dark suits and stone-faced, while behind Crockett sat her staff and immigration advocates, some of whom had personally lived through the consequences of Miller's policies. A few wore shirts displaying images of separated families, silent reminders of what was at stake. Major news networks interrupted their regular programming to broadcast the hearing live. Every glance, gesture, and reaction was being recorded for the nation to see. 2 p.m. sharp. Committee Chairman Jim Jordan gavelled the hearing to order. Maintaining decorum proved nearly impossible as anticipation grew. Democrats were ready to confront Miller with his record, Republicans prepared to defend him by shifting attention to present-day border issues. But everyone in that chamber, and everyone watching at home, knew the most awaited exchange would be between Stephen Miller and Jasmine Crockett. For the first 20 minutes, the tension quietly built. Several Democrats questioned Miller, but he handled them with practiced ease, dodging direct answers, speaking over their points, and returning to his memorized defenses. Republican members offered friendly openings, giving him room to repeat his claim that his actions had been driven by patriotism and necessity. Despite the sharp questioning, no one had yet managed to crack his composure. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Chairman Jordan looked up and announced, "The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes." The room fell still. Cameras zoomed in. Every sound faded except the soft hum of the microphones. Crockett leaned forward, her posture calm, her tone steady but firm. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice clear. "Thank you for being here today. I'd like to start with a straightforward question. Do you acknowledge that the family separation policy caused documented psychological harm to thousands of children?" Miller wasted no time in responding, his words coming out fast and deliberate. "Congresswoman, what I acknowledge," he said sharply, "is that the policy was about border security." Before he could continue, Crockett attempted to respond, but he immediately spoke over her, pressing his point. "The real trauma," Miller insisted, "comes from human traffickers and from policies in prior administrations that encouraged illegal crossings." Crockett raised her voice slightly, maintaining her composure. Her calm but firm tone cut through the noise, signaling that she was not going to be talked over this time. Crockett leaned slightly forward, her voice firm but measured. "Mr. Miller, I'm asking about the specific, documented trauma, not broad talking points." Before she could continue, Miller interrupted again, his tone rising as he leaned toward the microphone. "The so-called documentation you're referencing comes from biased sources, Congresswoman, sources that ignore the broader context of border enforcement." Crockett remained steady. "Mr. Miller," she said clearly, "this is my time, and I would appreciate," but he cut her off once more, speaking louder. "The border crisis," he insisted, "was the result of years of failed policies that President Trump and I were trying to fix. People like you." Murmurs rippled across the hearing room as the tension spiked. Chairman Jim Jordan gave a light tap of his gavel, barely enough to calm the crowd. "The witness will allow the member to ask her questions," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Miller leaned back, jaw clenched, eyes locked directly on Crockett. She, however, showed no sign of frustration. Flipping through her papers, she continued as if his interruptions were nothing more than background noise. "Mr. Miller," she resumed steadily, "I have here a memo from your own Department of Health and Human Services stating that family separation would cause, and I quote, significant and lasting psychological harm to children. This is your administration's assessment. Do you dispute this finding?" Miller immediately began to deflect. "What I dispute," he said forcefully, "is the claim that we didn't care about children. The memo itself states that." Crockett tried to interject, but Miller raised his voice, overrunning her. "Let's be clear," he said. "The previous administration built the detention facilities, they separated families too. They just refused to acknowledge that real border enforcement requires tough decisions." The audience stirred again. Some Democratic members shook their heads in disbelief, while even a few Republican colleagues shifted uncomfortably at Miller's combative tone. The cameras captured every moment, reporters typing updates almost in real time. Throughout it all, Crockett stayed poised. She calmly took notes, waiting for him to finish his long monologue. When he finally paused, she spoke with precision. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "I understand you have your rehearsed statements, but I'm referring specifically to documents from your administration, not anyone else's." Miller's response came out almost as a shout. "My administration? My administration saved lives. We stopped child trafficking that people like you refuse to acknowledge." Crockett turned to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman," she said evenly, "I'd ask that the witness be reminded to let me use my time to ask questions." Jordan gave another weak tap of his gavel. "Mr. Miller, please allow the Congresswoman to continue," he said, though the authority in his voice seemed to fade under the room's rising tension. Miller leaned back in his chair, his face flushed, fingers gripping the edge of the table. The air felt charged. Cameras clicked repeatedly as journalists posted the heated moment online. Crockett looked directly at him, her voice unwavering. "Mr. Miller," she said firmly, "I've been a civil rights attorney. I've been a public defender. I've stood in courtrooms across this country, and in all that time, I have never," before she could finish, Miller interrupted yet again, leaning forward with a faint smirk. "Your courtroom experience," he said sharply, "doesn't qualify you to speak on national security or border enforcement, Congresswoman." The room fell into uneasy silence. Even those who had been whispering moments before stopped to watch the face-off unfold, Crockett calm but fierce, Miller defiant yet visibly unsettled. This time, Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't appeal to the chairman or even move. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, arms folded, eyes steady. She simply waited. Miller continued talking, his voice echoing through the hearing room as he launched into a 30-second tirade about border security, trafficking, and what he called failures of past administrations. His tone grew louder, his gestures sharper, as if trying to reclaim control of the moment. When he finally stopped, perhaps expecting Crockett to fire back, she said nothing. 1 second passed, then another. The silence hung heavy, almost electric. Reporters froze mid-note, and even the air conditioning's soft hum could be heard. Every person in the chamber leaned forward, waiting for what she would say next. Then Jasmine Crockett spoke. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and so clear that it carried through every corner of the room. "Mr. Miller," she began evenly, "you've interrupted me 6 times now. 6 times you've shown this committee, and the American people watching at home, exactly who you are." Miller shifted slightly, opening his mouth to respond, but Crockett quietly lifted a single finger. Whatever he saw in her expression made him stop mid-breath. "You see," she continued, her voice steady but growing in force, "men like you have been interrupting women like me our entire lives. You interrupt because you believe your voice carries more weight. You interrupt because you think volume equals authority. But deep down, you know the truth. If you were forced to answer my questions honestly, if you had to face the evidence of the harm these policies cause to thousands of innocent children, your entire narrative would fall apart." The room was completely still. Not a sound. Miller's face, once flushed with anger, began to pale. His lawyers exchanged uncertain glances, frozen in place. Crockett calmly opened a folder in front of her and began sliding documents onto the table, one after another. "Let's go through these, Mr. Miller," she said steadily. "Since it's been difficult to ask you questions, I'll explain what your own records reveal." She picked up the first paper. "This memo from your deputy at the Department of Health and Human Services confirms that children as young as 8 months old were separated from their parents." 8 months. She held the paper up briefly, then set it aside. "This report from Customs and Border Protection shows there was no system, none at all, to reunite families once they were separated." The sound of shuffling papers filled the silence. "And this email chain," she continued, her tone firm but measured, "includes your name. It shows you dismissing concerns about the emotional harm these children would suffer, saying, and I quote, 'the deterrent effect outweighs other considerations.'" Crockett paused, fixing her gaze on Miller. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He seemed to try forming words, but nothing came out. "Other considerations," Crockett repeated quietly. "Those other considerations, Mr. Miller, were children. Babies. Toddlers. Young kids who will carry that trauma for the rest of their lives." Her tone stayed steady, but the words cut deep. "And you knew it. You all knew it. And you still went through with it." The audience couldn't stay silent any longer. Some people wiped away tears. Others nodded in agreement. The chairman struck his gavel several times, calling for order, but the emotion in the room was too strong to contain. Crockett, however, remained composed. "What truly matters, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice rising with conviction, "is that you can interrupt me, talk over me, or try to dismiss me, but I am still here. Those children are still suffering. Those families are still broken. And you," she paused, locking eyes with him, "you are still responsible." The chamber erupted once more, a wave of emotion sweeping through the crowd. In that moment, Crockett had not only taken control of the hearing, she had defined it.